I'm a professor of journalism here at the Carter Journalism Institute and the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program and the Science Communication Workshops. And we are about to start a very exciting Kavli conversation on multiple levels. It's the first one that we've ever done about photography, and I'm very excited about that. We have two very smart people, three, because of Lee Holtz, our longtime moderator, to talk about the power of images. And we also have some very exciting technical complications that we're working our way through. So we're hopeful that it's all going to work out. And thank you for being patient with us. I'm very grateful to both Jennifer Tucker and Lynn Johnson for appearing in Jennifer's case in person and Lynn's case virtually via Skype from Arizona, where she's attending to her parents. And as always, very grateful to Robert Lee Holtz for all of the work he puts in to create these amazing events. So I'll leave the formal introductions to Lee and just say thank you, Lee, for all that you do, especially for this one where there was a lot of interesting setup that was necessary. So with that, here is Robert Lee Holtz. He is a distinguished writer in residence here at the Carter Institute of Journalism and a science writer for the Wall Street Journal. Take it away, Lee.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. So welcome to the Kavli Conversations on Science Communications. Now, our purpose here this evening is, as always, to explore how we report science when we bring together the best in science journalism with the best in science communications to explore how new research reaches the general public. And, can we do it better? It can take more than words to create effective science journalism. Sometimes it takes no words at all, but some very powerful images. And that's really what we're going to be talking about tonight. So I should say these conversations are sponsored by the Kavli Foundation and the NYU Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program, which is directed by Professor Dan Fagan. I should say that we have one more in our fall series here. On November 12th, we're going to have something very special. We will be screening a new documentary on implicit bias, a topic of considerable medical and scientific controversy. When we'll be joined by filmmaker Robin Hauser, and then Harvard University psychologist Mazarin Bajani, who actually pioneered most of what we know about implicit bias, will also be joining us. And then we'll, as part of our conversation about the film, be conducting interactive testing with the audience on their unexamined and implicit biases. It should be extremely interesting. Now, as we go, this is a conversation, and so labeled, not a speech. So I encourage you, both here before me, but also lurking somewhere in the ether, that you favor us with your questions as we go. This is a conversation. Please use the microphone so that those of you here who ask questions, they can hear you online and can hear you for posterity. This is being recorded. And those of you online can tweet your questions by using the hashtag #KavliConvo. And I never know why I stare at the ceiling when I say those of you online. Are there angels gathered at the clouds? I'm not sure. So I want to frame our conversation with some numbers. Every day, people upload something like 350 million images to Facebook. To Snapchat, users share something on the order of 8,796 photos every second. All told, people upload an average of 1.8 billion digital images every single day. That's 657 billion photos per year. We may be taking pictures, but are we photographers? That's our canvas this evening. We want to focus on the selective power of the image in science journalism to drive story, to drive narrative. We're not here to discuss f-stops in Photoshop. We want to consider attention, patience, story choice, trust, ethics, respect, rejection, collaboration, how a photo becomes news, when is it journalism and when is it not, how does it become history. We want to consider how the camera's lens in the right hands makes the intangible visible and concrete. That's at the essence of so much of the journalism that we attempt to do. And we're going to go tonight where our eyes lead us, guided by National Geographic photographer Lynn Johnson and Wesleyan University visual historian Jennifer Tucker. Now, Lynn Johnson, normally based in Pittsburgh, is one of National Geographic's Women of Vision. She was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for feature photography for her National Geographic photo essay on gender. This past year, she was a Pulitzer finalist for her work on a National Geographic feature on the first U.S. face transplant operation. She was shortlisted for the Wellcome Trust Prize for Medicine in Focus. And among the best photos of the 76th Annual Pictures of the Year International, she earned first place in science and natural history. And all of those are the least of the things that she's accomplished. She is, as you can see, unavoidably in Tucson, Arizona this evening, and joins us through the miracles of FaceTime and the internet. Jennifer Tucker is here with us physically, studies scientific photographs to better understand history and culture and politics in areas from environmental history and law to popular science, medicine, and gun regulation. At Wesleyan, she's an associate professor of history, feminism, and of science and society. Her scholarship traces the use of visual evidence in environmental science and pollution reform, and visual exhibits in Victorian courtroom debates over air and river pollution. She's the author of a really extraordinary book, Nature Exposed, Photography as Eyewitness in Victorian Science. And as an authority on visual culture, she's written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, I'm pleased to say, the Washington Post, Time, and the Boston Globe. Now, this is going to be a little different from how we normally conduct these conversations. And if all goes well, here's how it's going to work. Lynn is going to guide us through a set of her images, each one of which is a potential talking point. She's going to tell us a little bit about how she responds to them, how they might have been taken. I might question her. I might ask Jennifer to do so. And then Jennifer is going to guide us through a set of images that highlight her work putting this in a visual historical context. Then we're going to look at pairs of images that the two of them have chosen together. All of these are talking points in our evening's conversation. So with some luck, Lynn, we're going to begin. And here I ask you, Lynn, to introduce us to a woman named Q.
Yes. First of all, thank you for allowing me to float in over the side there. And I'm delighted to be a part of this. Jennifer and I had some great conversations about our imagery, so different, and yet found some great common ground. So I will just begin and kind of talk briefly about each of these images. And Lee, please ask any questions that come to mind.
Yeah, I suppose I should say these are drawn from your reportage. These are images that are drawn from narratives, from journalistic pieces that you've done by and large.
Yes, so each of these images are from a story most likely done for Geographic, and I tend to get stories that are more about ideas or trends or moments or things like vanishing languages, et cetera, issues or viruses you can't see, but that deeply impact individual lives. And this young lady, Q, actually, I met Q doing a story about stress for Geographic, and knew that I wanted to address this scourge of military sexual trauma, and that found Q, and she agreed to be a part of this project. And the trend of this sexual violence in the military, on campus, and the church, I mean, we all are familiar with this, and I don't think that it has been addressed in the military at all. So it's at least 1 in 5 individuals, 1 in 5 women. I'm sure it's more than that. And you see Q inert on her couch, unable to really address her life. And she went into the Marines after 9/11, believing she was a patriot, and was similar. She was raped by her gunnery sergeant multiple times when she served in the Middle East. So the next, I don't know, do you want me to just go through these, Lee? Or
Until we interrupt you. I'm curious, just as a practical matter, this is an image deceptively in repose.
Yes.
It looks like, at first glance, it looks like someone taking a nap on a couch, and then as it grows on you, you start to feel something. One of the things that's very interesting about your approach to these invisible topics, as we'll see, is you make them intensely human.
I think I feel so grateful to have these kinds of challenges, because they are deeply human and are dependent on developing relationships with people. And at the same time, they're kind of intellectually challenging. How do you help someone who will never meet these people to see the impact of a blast, of an act of violence, of something disappearing, of something internal. And so there are always so many strands at work in the way one thinks, and how creative you have to be, and how you have to bring every part of yourself to building the relationship and the trust. And I spent many, many weeks with Q. This was just partway into our getting to know each other. And so she felt she could be completely herself. And hopefully what the reader, the viewer, feels is her kind of inert energy. And then, we want people to enter the photograph, to feel the photograph, and then ask, what is going on here? And learn more. We're really calling out to the curious. And so I hope this does that.
No, please go ahead.
So, and I think sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's not, but in every case, there's always so much more to the story than what you see. And I think all those numbers you mentioned at the beginning, as you introduced these ideas, is, people are not seeing anymore. They are simply amassing imagery, which is a different thing. That's like shopping. That's not seeing. And to be in the presence of someone who has suffered, and to know that they are asking you, giving you permission to put their story into the world, that is a deep responsibility. And so it's not a facile thing.
No, you said something interesting just a minute ago, Lynn, that leads us, I think, to the next picture. You are working with this idea in this photograph, but in the next image, the idea of making something internal and invisible visible. Tell us about this.
Yes, so this is Major Jeff Hall and his family. He experienced, in his time in Afghanistan, he experienced blast force injury, which actually cannot be seen on any kind of brain scan. It happens, that blast force injury in the brain happens in the cellular level and completely alters a person's ability to remember, to conform to any societal standards, to control their behavior and their violence. And so he was suicidal, and his wife, courageous soul that she is, said, I am not going to clean your brains off of the bedroom wall. I am not going to tell your girls who love you that you couldn't go on, that you didn't have the courage to go on. You will not destroy all of our lives. So he finally found some help at the Intrepid Center for Excellence in Bethesda, and he was a part of a creative process where they made these masks. So I got the assignment from Geographic. It was just presented to me on a piece of copy paper, a series of 20 masks on this page. And I didn't have any idea what the story was, but I looked at those kind of horrific suggestions of life experience, and I thought, an editor said, oh, do you want this story? And I was like, yes, I have no idea what it is, but I want to do it. And he said that this mask that he made was an amalgam of all the violence he had seen and all the violence he had created in the lives of others. And by making it, it helped him subconsciously unbury those memories and begin to deal with them and heal. So a very important and odd, an important moment to be back with his family and alive, and perhaps a little odd rendering of that, but meaningful, I hope.
So, as journalists, we're so often told, like, you can't pose a photograph. If we catch you, rearranging the scene, moving the baby booties closer to the wreckage of the car or whatever, you'll lose your Pulitzer. And yet it's very clear in this image and in others that we'll see, you're very willing to sort of create tableaus, I guess I'd call them. Tableaux vivants would be like the 19th century thing. And this is an example of that. Doesn't that make you uncomfortable as a photojournalist?
Not at all, because I think that photography as a language has many possibilities and incarnations. And I am always a journalist. I am always curious and searching for information and doing research. But the moment that one chooses to represent the reality of the story, I think has to fit with the intention, not just the editorial intention, but the intention of the people you're photographing. Their choice to face the camera and face the viewer is a powerful one. And, we can't just be tourists in other people's pain. At some point, it's much more dignified to say, yes, let's meet the eye. Let's both have courage on either side of that photograph.
Let me go to the next image. And Jennifer, I'm going to be interested in hear from you on this too, because here we're talking about Yeah, it won't tame itself. Wait a minute. There we go. An inanimate object. But it's an inanimate object with special resonance to New Yorkers, I think, and to Americans in general, but particularly to those of us who make our lives in this city. And it's presented, I don't know, as evidence almost of something. Tell us about it, Lynn, and then Jennifer, I'm curious about that aspect of this picture. So, Lynn, what are we looking at here?
Well, yes, I chose this picture because of Jennifer, because she had me thinking about evidence and photographs as evidence, and how an image can and a substance can be altered in meaning. So this is actually dust from the pile from 9/11, from that time that seared in everyone's memory, and it's being held by someone at the New York Historical Society. So it is actually, this is dust of, people and buildings and cars and dirt and paper. And the reality is that it is now an artifact, and it's been kind of purified in some way, but it still holds the power of that kind of collective memory. But it's definitely Jennifer that I looked at this picture and I was like, yes, this is a Jennifer photograph.
So what do you make of this image, Jennifer, seeing as you're the one that inspired its inclusion?
Yeah, so I'm very drawn to this picture because one of the things that we often see when we are looking at photographs that were taken, some of the photographic coverage around 9/11 is the photograph right before, just as the plane is about to hit the towers. And that was a photograph that became iconic. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think one of the decisions was made editorially not to show some of the photographs of what was happening below the buildings because there was so much destruction and gore. And so this kind of image of between life and death, and almost, I think what Barbie Zellweger talks about, the kind of as if the moment arrested in time when it wasn't clear exactly what was happening. I think what's so powerful about this image is it's showing, it was the dust from the artifact from the aftermath, and presented, with these gloved hands coming out with that, it's sort of disembodied. It makes that kind of reinforces its representation as forensic evidence, and in the context of some of the legal discussions around first responders. I think it has a lot of resonances. It's just a very powerful image and picks up the history of the visual language of specimens.
Okay. It's interesting because as an image, it takes something an event that was, of course, very powerful, very emotional, but also in some respects photographically was considered too painful to show. There are the photographs of the jumpers, which were published the day or two in the aftermath of the event, and then vanished from public memory because they were sort of by journalistic editorial agreement kind of expunged from the collective, because it was too invading the privacy of the person who's made that choice, because these were all people who chose. This has abstracted that into this kind of jar. It's a really strangely compelling image. And yet I wonder, to those of us who are seeing it for the first time, you need a caption, you need an explanation, you need to wrap this image in some words to really get its meaning. Lynn, do you need to lean on words, or you believe as a photographer that images alone could do it?
No, I love words. And I think we need words, and we need that marriage of words and imagery. And I said to Jennifer when we were working with this something about, the words on her images, and She said, oh, I have too many words. And I was like, no, 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 I love the words. I think we need the context because, that's just arrogance to believe that a photograph can do everything. It can't. And I think when presented with an image like this that is sort of spare and curious, once you know the backstory, once you have the language, then it becomes more powerful. We need those layers. But I think that, the bigger conversation is, why are we being excluded from seeing the powerful images that help us be realistic about what is going on in the world? And I know that's something that we'll deal with later in this set of images, but it's certainly, I think, more and more on the mind.
Well, let's move now to a more conventionally journalistic image.
So this is a young man in a Hanoi hospital. He's 21, and he is actually dying of the avian flu. So I did a story about they called it bird flu, traveling primarily throughout Asia, looking at the impact of this virus that was considered to be so deadly and a scourge and a reason for many animals to be slaughtered and people sequestered. And he actually survived this attack of avian flu and went home to his village. And at this moment, it was unclear whether he would survive. And so he's kind of oddly disembodied and without identity. But the gauze over eyes and mouth is to protect him and to keep him from being, dehydrated and even more at risk. So
in order to get to this photograph, Lynn, you had to work, you were not in a culture you knew well, not with a language you knew well, and you worked, you had a collaborator, you had a fixer.
Right.
That was a challenging relationship. How did you work that?
So this young man had a father, of course. His name is Minh Tuan. He was our fixer and interpreter. And he was very much worked against us in the beginning, us being the Tim Appenzeller, who was the writer on this story and science editor at Geographic at the time. And at some point, I just sat him down and I said, Minh Tuan, why are you standing in the way of us telling this story? It can be, it's so important for people to know the truth of this disease. And he told us about his dad and how he had suffered in the war. And of course, he blamed every American. And we just then started to build very consciously a different kind of relationship of listening and understanding. And I just said, we have to be a work family. We have to be, a team to tell this story. So I went off to Thailand to shoot something else for this project, and he actually called me and said, there's someone that you can photograph at the hospital. We don't know if he's going to live, but his family has given permission for you to be present to see the doctor's work and save his life. And so without that trust, it's not just the trust of the person on the other side of the camera, but with everyone that you work with, that is critical to telling a story in a meaningful way.
So our next image.
Yeah, so it seemed to make sense, even just visually, to continue to think about identity, because this young man robbed of his, and then, so this is a story for Geographic about this transplant, Katie Stubblefield, at a very young age, tried to commit suicide and destroyed about a third of her face. She was given another opportunity at life, thanks to a young woman who passed and her grandmother allowed a full face transplant. I was actually told not to photograph the donor. And so I thought, well, actually one doesn't think much at a moment like this, one just reacts. And I thought, this face is no longer the donor. This is a completely unattached, not just tissue, but identity. It has its own identity. And so it is in this no man's land. Clearly the doctors and nurses and the assembled medical team felt this kind of odd moment as well. Everyone was quiet and thoughtful as the young lady snapped these two images. And then they picked it up and put it on Katie, and 18 hours later, she had a new identity.
So you were told not to take this photograph.
Actually, I was told not to photograph the donor's identity.
Well, what is this if not the essence of identity on some
This is the essence
level?
of identity, but it is not. It is no longer on the donor. So this is an in-between state, and I think such an unusual and kind of magical, suspended, unique moment. I know that the photo editor on this project,
Is it a better angle for you? I'm sorry.
great work in getting permission to use this photograph. So,
But was it a struggle to get it used?
I believe there was a great deal of conversation around this image. Yes.
What were the editorial reservations, if you can tell us those?
You know, unfortunately, photographers at Geographic are not as much a part of those conversations as we used to be. So I cannot report details because I wasn't present. But I do believe that there was concern that it's disturbing at some level and awe-inspiring.
Jennifer, does this suggest anything to you? I
Right.
see you've got a kind of thoughtful look on your face.
Oh, did I? Well, I think, I'm interested in evidence of identity, so
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
later on we'll talk more about that. But yeah, it's a remarkable photograph.
Let's keep going.
Well,
then.
but is it like evidence of, I know that's
What?
fantastic. Is this an evidence also? Or is it something else because it's identity within the context of a moment is,
Yeah, I think maybe when we go look at some
No,
of the
we're
photographs.
asking you now, Jennifer. You got to ask. You got to rise to
That's
the
what made
moment.
me think
You're
of
stuck.
it.
You're stuck.
Well, I work on facial recognition, so one of the things that I'm very interested in the visual language of faces, and so I mean for me it's
Yeah.
I'm interested in context, so I think for me it's part of a visual field right now. This photograph belongs to a kind of a visual field of new imagery that we're getting, not only of facial recognition technology, but also possibilities through science technology to change how we appear, and lots of different motivations around that. So,
It is an interesting exhibit in facial recognition. Something perhaps more conventional, Lynn? What is this?
so I had an assignment to find imagery that would help us understand the moment of death. That challenge of when
The
or
moment
when-
of
when
death,
do
you
you-
said? The
what does
moment
it
of death?
mean? So these folks are standing at the curve of a road where a young man died, the son of the two young folks who have their names on John's chest. And the mom, Deanna, said she works for a transplant organization. This young man's tissues and organs saved multiple lives and made multiple lives better. So she feels that her son is dead, and she's at peace with that. But the dad says, no, and doubt that. Just put your hand on his chest, and you will feel his heart.
So you brought them all together.
Yes, I did, absolutely.
You didn't come across these people standing on the side of the road doing this ritual.
Oh,
You
no,
created this moment.
Absolutely. I called Deanna, and with the help of a colleague at Geographic who has this great website that promotes organ donation, and asked her if she thought everyone who received her son's tissues would come to this scene, would come to the place where he died. And it was really a remarkable experience for everyone. So, it's not just the photograph. It's the transformative power of physical presence in a specific place that was the best and most amazing part of the day.
Okay, let's, in an entirely different vein, let's then look at this.
So, story about zoonotic disease. This child is taking a monkey arm and a Gambian rat to market, and these are animals that are very, very sort of known to carry disease that impacts human. So, and then you can see that the impact of monkeypox in the next frame. This young man named Robert, he contracted monkeypox from bad meat, probably picked up off the floor of the forest, and so this is the reality of that he is suffering a great deal because of that, ingesting that meat.
And then this striking image.
Yes, so this is Vic Spitzer, and he is actually holding the frozen remains of a woman named Susan Potter. He's the gentleman that developed the visible human by slicing two convicts, a man and a woman, and reconstituting their bodies in computer form, so you could actually navigate the body. So this woman, Susan Potter, in her 70s, came to Vic and said, I want to be the next visible human. I'm going to die in a year. And he said, well, it was a long conversation anyway. He said, after some resistance, okay. And then it took her 15 years before
I was
she...
just going to say, how long did you work on this story?
Yeah, 15 years. 15 years.
15
So
years.
we went 15, 1-5, yes. So we've just followed her through her life and illnesses and her feistiness. And Vic actually, I found to be a man of great integrity. He kept every promise to her, and but he's a man of science. Mm-hmm. And he, in the end, he sliced her, and in the next image you see a cross section of Susan being rendered 1.05 micron at a time, and it will take another number of years to actually turn her into a computer model that anyone can navigate.
So we've gone from clinical medicine with Ebola, and to kind of classic, strange, but geeky science experiment with the visible human. What are we looking at here? So this just looks like, well, I don't know.
So I live in Pittsburgh and upriver in Springdale. There is the homestead of Rachel Carson. And this child is on a trampoline directly across the street from her home. And as you can see behind her, there's a power plant belching noxious and toxic fumes. So again, I was very much influenced by Jennifer and the images that she showed me, the work that she's doing and that she collected from Victorian times, and the fact that we've been poisoning our environment for how many years. So these next two images speak to that, but in modern times. So this child and the industrial sort of fouling of the air. And in the next image, family in Guatemala and the household air pollution that they have to face there. It's household pollution, actually. Heating with wood and cooking with charcoal is one of the leading causes of the most serious chronic health problems in the world. So I just think it's these flow nicely and powerfully, hopefully, to Jennifer's work, because these are specific individuals who are suffering because of this and impacted.
I'm not going to
one of
actually
billions,
yield control
Oh,
Please.
and let Jennifer set her
Can
pace
I
here.
set it
You
up to
just all you have to
slide?
do is just boom,
yeah.
Yeah.
and not do that, which I'm.
Not going to.
What do you want to do? Okay, we'll lose her now.
Oh,
It's all right. Go ahead.
well, we can't
Good.
see it either.
Yeah,
so
exactly. See, that's
That's why I'll let you.
I
do
see.
it.
Well, there we are.
While you're setting it up, one of the projects that I'm working on now, and one of the things
This
that
is what we have to work with.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Is Victorian photographic pollution albums. So I'm interested in the politics of evidence, and Lynn and I had a great conversation about the history of visualization of pollution. So this is just one of the projects. I'm just showing you like 4 or 5 slides of some projects I'm working on, so you get an idea of the kind of things that I think visual historians are interested in. On the left is a photograph from 1898 of a town in Widnes, England, which was the crucible of the Victorian chemical industry. On the right is a photograph from a nuisance law case in 1857, which was one of the first nuisance cases that was brought in environmental regulation law in the UK. And it happens that this was also an early case where photographs were used as legal exhibits in Victorian law. And it's one of the things you can see with the photograph, the materiality of it is that even the chemical surface of the paper is affected by the chemical surrounds. So that's a project. And another project has to do with a British filmmaker, Humphrey Jennings. I'm interested in a project he worked on. He was a surrealist artist. He was also a British filmmaker who made documentary films. And he put together a scrapbook of press clippings from that spanned the kind of early history of industrialization. He was interested in the impact that industrialization had on emotions and kind of the inner landscape of the UK using images. And I think he's one of the first. It's one of the first modern histories to tell the history of modernization through images. This is a project I've been working on with some colleagues in Europe and in Australia who are interested in magic lanterns and magic lantern slides. And so this is a project looking at the kind of institutions that have collected images and circulated them, sort of looking at changing modes of spectatorship and viewing. And the next one, this is a project I have been doing some research lately on firearms and history and law. And so kind of going beyond the semantic connections between photography and guns, sort of looking at the history of the business of technology and cameras. So, you know, someone like Eastman Kodak was also a hunter. He took his life with a gun. And there are a lot of interesting connections between the technologies of both of these industries. So we think of them as separate, but actually they were really connected both at the level of the manufacture of triggers and optics and belt line assemblies and all of that, especially in the 19th century. This is a project, the Evidence of Identity project. We just
Wait, I'm just screwing it up here.
no,
Forgive me.
this was about this is a project looking at the role of photographs as evidence in court cases. So judges don't really like to create new categories of evidence, and so photographs had to enter into existing categories. This is a case. It's a case from the 1870s where photographs were used as evidence of identity in an imposture case. And what we're seeing on your right is a photograph that was made to try to use photographs of two men to try to prove that they were the same person by showing that the diameter of their irises was the same. So it's before Francis Galton was developing composite photography, and it's a very interesting example of how, you know, in this case, photographic experts were on both sides of that debate. And then this is another project looking at the entanglements of photography and law. On the left is a print, it's from the Graphic, it's from an illustrated newspaper showing a prisoner being, it's an artist's rendition of a prisoner being photographed in jail. And so thinking about photography as a detective medium, a lot of times scientists talked about photography being a detective medium also. And so on the newspaper, in the pages of the newspaper, there would be stories about photographic detections of murderers and thieves and so on, as well as coverage of some of the news of the first photographs of a comet, other elusive phenomena. So these kind of, the talk was overlapping. So these are just as Lynn and I were talking about things. You know, I work on sort of context of photography. I've deliberately selected images that aren't iconic, and that's because I think we know a lot about some of the iconic images, and yet there are just lots of images out there, and we need to know more about them. We need to know more about the work they do in society and how they circulate and how they're used and what their meanings are. So I tend to be kind of I tend to try to avoid talk about the essence of photography because it really is so polysemic and there's so much contestation around it. That's what's really interesting to me. So this is one of the first daguerreotype photographs by Daguerre, a street scene on a boulevard. It's a very active street, but we don't really see that many people in it. We see the outlines of someone shining someone's shoes, and yet we can see in the next image. This is a print from exactly the same time by a French artist. It's a lithograph, Theodore Morrissey, who's imagining here what the title is Daguerreotype Mania, and it's just picturing what the world would look like in the future with the daguerreotype. And so even though, you know, photography hadn't really started yet, we can see in the print, and you can look it online if you want to see the print in more detail. Aerial photography, the photograph of the sun in the top left. You've got, you can't really see them, but you can see the gallows. Those are painters. So it's anticipating that famous saying that painting is dead. So he's got also mass culture, people lining up to have their portrait taken. On the back is a train. Those are cameras. So he's really got the whole idea of the industrialization of photography and its commodification in 1839. So
well, also it
this
occurs
really
to me
got going.
that from the beginning it looks like we also had issues of authenticity and deception. I mean,
Yeah.
the wonderful daguerreotype you just showed us of the person getting their shoes shine. I mean, that's sort of famous because it's a photograph, the first photograph of somebody by themselves. You know, and of course, as you just pointed out, in fact, it's a very crowded street. It's just the artifact of how long it took to expose those kinds of pictures. So we value it for something as a historical artifact of something that it's in fact not.
Yeah, and that's a point that a lot of these artifacts, when the context changes, we see different things in them, and we value them for different reasons. So this next one is I selected this one. This is the Golden Record, which was which Carl Sagan and his team at JPL put together this record of images to send up on Voyager 2 in 1977. So they were trying to make contact with intelligent life in outer space and gathered 118 images, photographs of, a lot of them were drawn from National Geographic. A lot of them were drawn from newspapers, Life magazine and others. It was like a picture postcard to intelligent life if they happened to come across this record, which was attached to to Voyager 2. And it was kind of reminiscent of that Assyrian king who rebuilt Babylon and who put praises into the bricks as it was being built for posterity. Sort of and I think the whole project raises questions about, where do these images go, who sees them, whoever is going to see them, and in this case they weren't really sure. They didn't even know if Martians had eyes or what, but they had this idea, and it's interesting for what's not in there. They're not photographs of war, poverty. It's a cheerful image of of Earth.
Earth as we would like it to be.
Yeah. So these are just pairs of images showing. On the left is from 1865. It's from the Illustrated London News, and it's a depiction of a scene at the meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, which was an organization that was trying to bring together scientists from different disciplines and to really promote the popularization of science. So they're gathered together looking at the projection of natural specimens onto a screen. And on the right is a photograph by a photographer. The title of it is The Information Revolution, by Louis Pythosis. I'm not sure if I'm saying his name correctly, but it's showing the media monitors around a single individual, just showing how the modes of transmission of these photographs have changed. So this is just a couple of images to kind of maybe stimulate some discussion about data. So on the left is a photograph of lightning taken in 1895 by Arthur Claydon for the Meteorological Society, and on the right is some visual data depicting some of the mapping of Mars. And in both cases, even though they're made at different times in different places with different kind of media, there are teams of people behind them. So it's partly to also connecting to the point you raised earlier about storytelling, that behind these images, the production of them isn't as seamless as it might appear. There are there's a lot of work behind creating these images. And some of this work there's a sociologist named Janet Vertese who's done a lot of work on the depiction of Mars, the Mars rover project. And this is just, so 1905 at Lowell Observatory in Arizona, the first successful photographs of Mars were taken, and there they are on the left, a big plate of mini Mars. But the problem was, in 1907, the Wall Street Journal published a story. Its lead story was that the first successful photographs of Mars had been taken. There was a lot of interest in whether or not they proved the existence of canals on Mars. The problem was, though, that getting it onto the page was, by enlarging the Martian photographs, you lost the definition of the canals, so they lost their evidentiary value. So many newspapers actually created these drawings to try to convey the excitement of it. So here you have the angel with the Kodak camera taking a photograph of what's actually a drawing, but underneath the caption it says a photograph of Mars, even though it's a drawing. So just problems of translation. Is it this one?
Yeah.
And also just photography as a subject of experiment and mystery. On the left, Ferdinand Herder and Vera Driffield were inventors. They were also industrial chemists, and they invented this instrument for estimating photo exposure. And so just and on the right is Driffield's daughter May. So she's a teenager in this picture, and in his notebook are photographs of her helping him with his experiments as he's trying to test the actinometer. So she's it's also just part of the sort of social relations behind the production of photography. And I just have a couple more. Yeah, because we're in New York, I also wanted to mention there's this this photographer who's a scientist, Philip Cavell, who won a lot of awards for his photographs in the 1930s. He made photographs for the Museum of Natural History in London, and he created a method for doing ballistics research on guns. But he also made lots of photographs for magazines. And I think that phrase in the ad that he did for Waterman's, these amazing photomicrographs tell their own story. It's part of the idea that's attached to photography for a long time. Photography is the pencil of nature. These are both lantern slides, on the left from the 1890s and on the right from the early 1900s. And we might not necessarily think of these as being scientific photographs, but I think, really thinking about a lot of the work that Lynn's been doing in her photographs, I would argue that they are. The one on the left is evidence of work in the alkali industry, and on the right of the brutal exploitation of rubber plantation workers. And so on the left is, it's actually a drawing reproduced by means of a lantern slide showing an alkali worker gassed by chlorine. And on the right are two children in the rubber plantation business in the Congo Free State. In the 1890s, their limbs might be chopped off if they didn't supply the requisite number of the requisite amount of rubber. So I think it's part of that kind of contest over imagery. And there was I don't know how many people might have seen an article last week.
Tell us about this, because it's an interesting editorial decision that is itself an interesting editorial commentary on the nature of news photography. So explain to us what you're alluding to.
So last week, the Guardian newspaper reported on its editorial decision to really reflect more on the photographs that accompany its stories about climate change. And they said that there's been an idea that photographing, including photographs of the polar bears on the ice, are another, and also some of the big data visualization have their place, that they're worried that they're not showing enough of the human impact of climate change. And so sometimes stories about heat, how hot it is, will be accompanied by photographs of tourists at the beach trying to cool off. So they said this is an intentional decision that they're making to change the visual field of this story.
Yeah. It's interesting because it's an editorial decision, and it's an editorializing decision. It's like the Guardian, which has made, it's a wonderful newspaper, but it's made very clearly climate change reform as a central editorial tenet. And they clearly came to the realization that they could print as many pictures of heartsick, forlorn polar bears as they wanted. We honestly, in the end, apparently don't care. So what they need to do to marshal our support is to start picturing us as victims. So it's sort of news and not news, and editorializing with images.
Lynn, have you ever editorialized with an image? I mean, do you try to stack the deck there so that I'm going to walk away ready to give money to the Environmental Defense Fund or Save the Whales?
Well, I think one has to be very clear about who you're working for and with, and there's work I do as an activist, and there's work I do as a journalist, and that's why having integrity in the work is so important. You have to know where those lines are, and I think it takes a lot of thought and consideration. But one thing that you said, Lee, is that nobody is being moved any longer by the watching images of the struggling animals, so let's do struggling humans. Well, nobody seems to care about the struggling humans either. So I think that's part of the conversation is, are we so saturating? I mean, this is not an old conversation, but I mean, this is an old conversation that we're saturating the world with imagery of suffering. for various reasons, and people are becoming immune to those images, and therefore it takes more and more extreme messaging to move people to action. And so I think this is where it gets very complicated, because then photographers, writers, editorial boards are faced with this conversation. Do we consciously become, step over that line into activism, because the world is clearly at a critical impasse?
I'd like to step over that line myself into a question.
Yes, it's actually very related to this issue. So we are talking here about photography as a way of evidence or like fact. But I think photography has also been used like an ideological artifact. I remember recently, actually the National Geographic issued like this big edition on kind of saying sorry for the way they portrayed non-white cultures basically all around the world. That makes you reflect on how actually factual is photography. If it's not editorial, like from scratch, like from the moment you decide to portray something as the way you portray it. The same thing with writing, I think. So, I don't know, I think I want to hear your thoughts on that, on is there actually a line between photography as a fact, or is just every photography biased, which I think is something we will touch more on in our next Kavli, but I just feel like it's, I don't know, I think it's important to have that conversation now.
The line, I think it's a very, very good question.
If there's a line even.
Photography by its very nature presents itself, willingly or no, as a fact. You believe the evidence of your eyes. And of course, the evidence of your eyes are not necessarily that. Lynn, what would you respond to that question?
Well, I think that a photograph is always at risk of not being the truth. It's the truth of the moment. It's the truth of what you witness at the time. You can have all the integrity in the world and do great research, but you're only there for a moment and in somebody's life. And so you see that current truth, but you bring to the process all of the bias of who you are, your ethnicity, your language, your gender, your birth story, your all of the societal mores that you embrace or deny. And so we are imperfect filters as communicators. I think that's why you have to work so hard to be informed before you go into the field to document any issue, person, environment. But that's why we need an educated populace who can look critically at images, and we need to be educated about deciphering imagery. And that's why I think the work that Jennifer is doing is super important, because we cannot always, you just can't look at the surface. You must look deeper.
Well, and increasingly you have to sort of do a pixel by pixel analysis to determine the authenticity of an image. Jennifer, you study photography as evidence. I mean, how do you respond to that question?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great question, and one of the reasons why I think that what interests me about photographs is that they do seem sometimes carry this sort of authority, and yet, again and again, we see their authority undermined or challenged or critiqued, and so it's the debates over that really interests me. But I think one example of that, and there's some great work on National Geographic photography and also on some of the ideologies behind, the photographs in colonial classification and racial classification. I'm thinking about some work by Jane Leiden, who's just written a great book on photography and humanitarianism and empire. She's working on the Australian context. But one example we could talk about there is that in UNESCO in 1950, I think it was, came up with this idea of bringing together an exhibition of human rights. And so there was behind it this idea of photography as a universal language, and they were gathering together photographs of war dead, of families, of housing, you know, across the world, and finding examples of photographs that seemed to show similar activities across different places. And it was part of this idea of, partly it was coming after the World War, of trying to figure out what people shared in common. But one of the things, you know, looking back at them, what's really clear is that these were also about a certain kind of imposition of cultural values on this story. So there wasn't really a lot of universal language connecting all of them. It was completely ideological, but in the so you had this kind of tension between it. And I think that there's these are socially constructed. So that's why we can't really stop thinking about photographs at their moment of origin, but you know, what happens when they go out in the world, and what kinds of motivations, you know, bring them into the world to begin with. That's really what's behind it.
So let's go back into a set of images. Lynn, if we can, you know, quickly walk through these. This is, what are we looking at here? These are really sort of pairs of images. The first
Yes,
here,
pairs of images, and actually this speaks to the conversation we were just having about, you know, doing a story that is in balance with whatever the reality is. This is a story about cannabis for Geographic, and
About cannabis.
so this little girl actually had a lifetime of seizures and was almost completely incapacitated until her mom started giving her cannabis oil, and she literally just like has a completely different life now. So the story ended up being, you know, really about the cannabis that can be addictive and derail a life of an intelligent young woman into, you know, like using her body to sell this weed, and a child whose life is saved by cannabis. The next story, the next pairing is done for the gender issue, and this young lady on the swing is Odie, and Odie was born male and is a young trans child. So Odie is female, has been female in her mind, and will be in her body from very, very young, 2 years old. So this is really about society and how we treat people who we perceive as different. In Jamaica, this trans woman actually fears for her life every day. So she's been like stabbed and shot and had a machete hack at her face. And again, a portrait, and you know, I think a portrait is like lifts itself out of the realm of journalism. It might be good research that gets you to the person, but then you know, this is not trying to be a documentary image. This is an image that is making a statement about brutality. And
then the next image on the swing.
this is
Next
a child
pair,
who's
next pair.
living on the autism spectrum. And I thought this little boy, photographed in a special school in America, where he has the benefit of this sensory room, so different than the next child that is in the X-ray room of a hospital in Thailand, who is blown up, as they say, by a landmine. So he is Burmese. He's a Karen child. And, you know, it's just by, like, where were you born? What kind of life will you have? And you know, I think the photography, one of the great parts of photography is that you have body language as a strand of communication. And so, you know, I'm always looking for that sort of beautiful grace within the frame and within the photograph to pull someone in and get them to want to know more about the situation. Story about vanishing languages.
This is about vanishing languages, you said?
Yes, Vanishing Languages. Yeah, this is Johnny Hill. He is one of the last speakers of the Chimweve language. He lives in Arizona. And the next, so, trying to figure out how to make language visible was challenging. I would either start with the word or a significant phrase in another language and look for an image that resonated, or go the other direction, just like immerse myself in a culture, look for beautiful imagery, and then find a word that would speak to that image.
And what word does the picture of the child represent?
This is shot in Tuva in Siberia, and new babies are called My Little Goat. That's a translation, obviously. So that's the word that we used under this image. That precious moment, fragility at the beginning of life. It's very tender. So not so tender, the next image. This is actually Columbine. I think, again, Jennifer and I have interests in these areas of, it's actually interesting listening to you talk about this, Jennifer, and the language you use, so different. But this is a kind of evidence picture. This is a scene of the crime, really. Even though it was shot recently, this is where Dylan Klebold and a friend killed their classmates. And this next image is Sue, his mom. She is in the process of figuring out how to take this great tragedy and help people understand that it is tied, that act of violence is tied to a mental health issue, an issue that really hasn't been paid attention to.
Who is she with here, Lynn?
She's with a woman who was the child of a teacher that was most likely shot by her son. The next image is Sandy Hook. In my research, I learned that the flagpole of this original school was the only item that was not destroyed. I'm actually not sure that's still true, but they completely ground the original school to dust and rebuilt. So, but this symbol of the flag, of the American flag, of our country, that cannot seem to solve this problem of gun violence, I just felt that it was the message.
Lynn, as a practical matter, if I may just ask as a matter of craft, I'd like to know how you got this image. I mean, how did you get this angle on this? Where were you standing?
So I was in town for about a day or two, and I just kept driving back to the school in different times of day to see the light. And I would walk around, and I saw this shadow start to encroach on the pavement there. And so I just came back to kind of haunt the shadow, and just stood on the roof of the car.
You stood on the roof of your car?
Yeah, I'm like 5 foot tall, Lee, so I had to stand.
And how long did you wait standing on the roof of your car for the image to line up right?
Yeah, for a couple of hours.
Couple of hours on the roof of your car.
I just wanted it to be just right, and and then the wind would stop, and then it would start again, and then it would, So once you see the potential of something, I just felt I needed to stay with it, and to feel that place. And is it a haunted place? It is not without energy there.
And this image, excuse me.
So these are the hands of a young man who is a psychopath. There's a gentleman doing a lot of research into the brains of young offenders, really truly violent psychopathic offenders, and a facility that houses these young people. So he's holding a chart that shows his behavior, his violent behavior over the course of, a week. And in this institution, they're trying to change the behavior of these young folks. Using all kinds of behavior modification, reward systems, and believing that the neural pathways can be altered, the neural pathways that have to do with violence.
I think we have a question here in the
I
shadows.
do. So I'm looking at these incredibly gorgeous photographs and thinking I just couldn't do that, feeling like I couldn't. And I'm thinking that the kind of photos that I used to take when I was in the position of needing to take photos for my own work were more like the documentary photos that you were showing us from the Victorian times. And I would like to, today in journalism, unfortunately, the situation, the Nat Geo situation is atypical, and often writers are expected to shoot their own photos, and we wind up doing more documenting than we do sort of communicating emotion well. So I'm wondering, just in the few minutes that we have left, what kind of practical advice do you both have for those of us who, want to try to do better with our photos, but we wind up just sort of doing basic documentation?
Jennifer, how would you answer that question?
Well, I have a question for you, I guess. What are the photographs for that you're thinking of?
Right. Well, that is a kind of a deep question, is what is a photograph for? And photographs have multiple purposes. Honestly, in a digital environment, really the purpose of a photograph is to draw the reader in. But we want to do more than that. We want to we want to try to communicate some emotion, and we also want to document something important to the story. We want to be able to communicate to the viewer what something looks like, and ideally also what something feels like.
I feel like Lynn, as a photographer, will probably have more to say on this issue.
Maybe
but
so,
yeah.
But you have.
But I think in terms of, in terms of looking at photographs for the news, I don't think, even though we call photographs evidence, it's very much part of the visual storytelling. So I think one of the things that would be great to see is, in relationship to a lot of these stories, to have, Lynn's examples are so unusual in terms of how a lot of photographs appear in the newspaper, I think. So if we look at, there are a lot of, because hers are very distinctive. So if you could think about the way that epidemics get reported, a lot of times it's photographs of people in hazard suits, and they become this kind of a trope. And so I think, I feel like I have been thinking more about interpretation and how we can, maybe be more aware of how we may be kind of sometimes a bit lazy in how we're thinking about photographs illustrating a story, and need to be more reflective about how the images are working in relationship to the words, and not just drawing attention to the story.
Dan's making an important point, because many of us who are not photographers by talent or profession are stuck with taking pictures in a journalistic context, because the news search algorithm demands an image at the top of the story. It's just how it works. So you have to have an image begged, borrowed, or stolen. Lynn, how would you answer Dan's question?
I think if you click twice to this image of Ms. Jeffries holding the autopsy image of her daughter, it's so powerful. Because it really, if you click two down, it's the next, image that Jennifer brought. This this photograph, I think, kind of answers the question. It is evidence. She is holding evidence. It is a stark and disturbing photograph of her daughter's body. And yet it's a photograph of this mom and her emotional state in what appears to be her home. So it is a storytelling image of a woman holding an artifact and evidence. And it's kind of the blend, it's the perfect blend of everything we've been talking about. And, sometimes I think we try to be too artful, and we forget that sometimes you just need the facts. You just need to be raw, and you just need to put the truth of what you see right in that moment out there. And that's why I love this image, and I love that you've included it, because the shock of that child and how her body has been, harmed is important for us to see. We have to see.
These are also, are they not, Jennifer and Lynn, the very images that we were prevented from seeing, even though parents wanted to show them, of their children who were killed in this incident. They were considered more than we should have to bear or something. Jennifer, what's the context here?
Yeah, can we move to the next screen? I'm not sure how. Yeah, so a lot of parents were, I think in relationship to the Newtown shooting, the shooting at Sandy Hook, there was, in the state of Connecticut, there's a debate over freedom of information, so journalists had wanted to see the photographs that were taken at the crime scene. There was a lot of debate about whether or not those should be released to the public. And in the end, the Connecticut General Assembly voted that, with the exception of one, voted that they shouldn't be. And I think I have in the next slide some of the comments that were made at the time, the reasons why they shouldn't be. So a lot of the families didn't want them released. And so, and one of and there were a lot of, these are some of the quotes from the senators in the General Assembly saying, who would want to see these anyway? These are awful photographs. There was one who said, I think there's a bigger issue here, and that has to do with, who ought to see them. These are photographs that were taken by police officers, and they represent a crime. They're part of a crime scene. So it raises a question that's, it's not easy to answer. Are these photographs family albums? Are they privacy? Are they subject to privacy concerns? Or are they things that the public needs to see? Because if we think about the history of social movements around atrocity photographs, a lot of time, or atrocity, sometimes photographs have mobilized public opinion around it. We happen to see in gun violence disparities around that, and racial disparities around that, what kind of gun violence. So that Nadine Jeffries is an example of archival exposure, of showing photographs. That's from an autopsy photo that she stands in front of, whenever there are debates about guns, often she'll stand there with the photograph of her daughter, because it's not the kind of photograph that people will normally see in the newspaper.
So we're drawing near the end of our time, and I'd like to ask a variation of Dan's question to each of you, which is, what's my job as a journalist when it comes to photography? What is the thing that I should be doing, Lynn? What's my job?
Oh, your job is to decide for yourself what you're trying to say and who you're speaking to and who's in front of you. And, I think all of the lines are blurring. And, but the essence is to be as educated, informed, and considered as possible. And to dig deep, because it's so easy to stay on the surface of a situation, and every situation is very complicated. So I don't think it's a black and white thing. It's not. It's more complicated than ever. And so, you know, you have to decide. That's part of being a professional and part of taking it seriously. And I think one of the really delightful parts of this presentation that Jennifer put together is these last 4 or 5 pairings, because they show you how complicated some of these decisions are.
Just roll through, I think, yeah. You know, that last one, we were just, the vanishing languages, how do you depict the vanishing of languages? And on the other hand, we have all of this, we're really, we're learning a new language in a way. Together we're learning a new language as a visual languages, so that kind of pairing. I mean, I think for reporters, it's that the story is the changing ways we visualize the world. I mean, I feel like, you know, that's another dimension of reporting that we could be talking about more in answer to that question.
And I could not think of a more apt way to close, except to say this has taken place under the most difficult circumstances, that spanning thousands of miles and centuries of photography and enormous reservoirs of goodwill from Lynn, from you, Jennifer, from our audience, both visible and invisible. And I just thank you, all of you, for what you've done here together tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.